Let's get started. Story number 1.
In 1996, my cousin Marek moved to a crumbling rural village in southeastern Poland called Nałamleczna. He was a literature professor from Warsaw, weary of city life after his divorce and looking for solitude to finish a book he had been working on for over a decade. The village was barely a cluster of homes, scattered near the edge of a dense forest called Las Krzyży, the Forest of Crosses. People had been abandoning the place since the late 80s, and by the time Marek moved in, only 6 families remained. He bought a stone house on the farthest edge of the village, the last before the forest line. It had been empty for years. The windows were cracked, the roof sagged under moss, and the inside smelled like rot and mold. But Marek was a stubborn man. He spent the first few weeks fixing it up with the help of a local named Bartek, who agreed to help in exchange for vodka and a few hundred zloty. When I visited him in the summer, he was proud of the changes. He'd restored the wooden floors, cleaned out the cellar, and set up a small study with shelves of dusty books and a big wooden desk by the window that looked directly into the forest. He joked that if he stared long enough into the trees, they'd start whispering ideas for his novel. But even during that first visit, I sensed something wasn't right. The air in the village was heavy. Not just because of the humidity, it was something else, an unease I couldn't explain. The people were friendly but strangely cautious, as if they had learned not to ask too many questions or speak too freely. They avoided the forest. Nobody walked their dogs near it. Kids didn't play by the edge. And every time I asked why, I got the same vague answer. It's not a place for people. One evening, as Marek and I sat drinking outside under the low flicker of his porch lamp, I asked about the forest. He shrugged and said, "Old stories, superstitions. They say the forest swallows people, but no one has disappeared here in years." Then he added something strange. "But at night, sometimes I hear things." I asked what kind of things. He hesitated, then said, singing, low, broken songs, like someone humming from deep in the trees. I laughed. He didn't. Later that night, long after I'd gone to bed, I awoke suddenly. It was almost 3 a.m. I didn't know why I was up, but the house was dead silent. I was staying in a small guest room on the ground floor, and my window faced the forest. I got up to get water, passing through the hallway that connected the study to the kitchen. That's when I heard it. Faint, almost not there, like the sound was being pulled apart by the air. A woman's voice humming. It wasn't a melody I recognized. The voice was cracked, like someone humming through dry lips, slow and tuneless. I froze, pressing my back to the hallway wall. It was coming from outside, maybe 20 feet from the house, near the tree line. I didn't wake Marek. I told myself it was the wind or an animal. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, he seemed tired, and I could tell he hadn't slept much either. I didn't say anything about the voice. The villagers were no help. When I casually asked a woman at the local store about the forest, she stopped mid-sentence and just said, "You shouldn't talk about such things. The forest listens." Marek didn't mention the singing again, but I noticed he started sleeping with his study door closed and a small cross nailed to the inside of it. A few days before I left, I caught him researching Polish burial rites and pre-Christian pagan customs. I teased him, asking if he was joining a cult, and he only smiled. "Some of the old stories are darker than people think," he said. "They're warnings, not fairy tales." After I left, we kept in touch. His emails started getting strange around October. He'd mention hearing knocking at night from the trees, not like branches hitting the windows, but rhythmic knocking. 3 times, every few hours. He thought it might be someone playing a prank. But there were no teenagers left in the village. He said he saw lights flickering in the woods, even though there were no houses there. Once, he found a small animal skull placed neatly on his doorstep like an offering. He stopped answering my emails by December. I drove down in early January. Snow had buried the whole region. The roads to Nałamleczna were barely cleared. When I got to Marek's house, the place looked deserted. The windows were frosted over from the inside. No smoke came from the chimney. I knocked, waited, then walked around the back. The back door was ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was freezing. The firewood was untouched. A mug of tea, long dried, sat on the table. His coat hung by the door. Nothing seemed taken or packed. It was like he had gone out for a moment and just never returned. The strangest thing was the study. It had been trashed, papers torn and scattered, books ripped from shelves. The cross on the wall was gone. In its place was a crude symbol scratched into the wood, a circle with a slash through it and two lines radiating outward. It looked old, pagan, not something Marek would draw. And on the desk was a note. It wasn't signed, but I knew his handwriting. It read, "They don't sleep anymore. The song is for me now. I saw her last night. She was crying by the trees. I think she wants me to follow. If I go, maybe it will stop. If I don't, I think she'll come inside. I'm so tired." I called the police, but they didn't find anything. No footprints in the snow, no signs of struggle. They said he probably wandered into the forest and got lost. They searched for 2 weeks and found nothing. No body. No clues. The villagers didn't seem surprised. One of the older men just said, "The forest takes who it wants." The house sat empty after that. I visited a few more times, mostly to make sure it hadn't been looted. I brought a priest once to bless it. He refused to go inside. Over time, I started having dreams. Always the same. I'm in the forest, walking toward a sound I can't resist. The humming. It grows louder the deeper I go. Then I see her. Just a shape, not fully human. Long limbs, tangled hair, eyes that don't reflect light. She never speaks, but she always points behind me. When I wake, I always feel like I've brought something back with me. 3 years ago, the house finally collapsed during a storm. No one rebuilt it. The village is almost gone now. Only 2 families remain. The forest grows thicker every year, reclaiming the space. They say new trees have started growing where the foundation was. Even though the ground there is still dry and cracked, people still report strange things. A hiker disappeared in 2019. Dogs refuse to enter the woods, and sometimes in winter, late at night, the villagers say they can hear singing. Low, broken songs coming from deep between the trees. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It started the moment I arrived at my ancestral village, nestled deep in the Carpathians, a place barely marked on any map, called Zeleny Lug. The roads were narrow, muddy from the recent rains, and flanked by dense, ancient woods that seemed to lean in, whispering secrets in a language only the wind understood. The village had not changed in decades. Wooden cottages with peeling paint, sagging roofs, and ornate, faded carvings around the windows. Relics of a Slavic past stubbornly clinging to the present. I had left years ago, chasing a future in the city, where the hum of life drowned out any talk of spirits or old curses. But now I was back, summoned by the death of my grandfather, a man who had lived in the house on the edge of the forest since before I was born. My parents had always warned me never to go alone into the woods after dark. "They are not for the living," my grandmother said once, eyes dark and serious beneath her kerchief. "The Lishi watches, the Rusalka waits, and the souls of the restless wander with the mist." I laughed it off then. Now I wasn't so sure. The house was colder than I remembered, even in the heat of early summer. The thick wooden walls seemed to swallow sound, and shadows gathered in corners like cobwebs. I spent the first day cleaning, sorting through my grandfather's belongings, dusty books of Slavic folklore, jars of dried herbs, candles, and small carved idols. There was a particular charm he always wore around his neck, a small wooden talisman carved into the shape of a tree entwined with a serpent. That night, as the wind whipped around the eaves, I heard it. The faint sound of singing carried on the breeze from the direction of the forest. The melody was mournful and sweet, the kind of song that pulls at your heart and chills your blood at the same time. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or a passing traveler, but the sound seemed to come closer, circling the house. Unable to sleep, I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. The village was silent except for the singing, which stopped abruptly the moment I crossed the threshold. The air was thick and damp, smelling of moss and decay. I scanned the tree line, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a figure, pale, with long wet hair, standing motionless between the birches. I blinked. It was gone. The next day I spoke to an old woman at the market, a local named Varvara. Her eyes were sharp and her skin weathered like parchment. "You heard the singing, yes?" she asked without preamble. "Yes," I said. "Do you know what it is?" Her gaze darkened. "That is the Rusalka's song, the spirit of a girl who drowned long ago in the river nearby. She lures the living to join her in the water's cold embrace." I shivered. Is it dangerous? Very, Varvara said. She's lonely, angry, and she's not the only one you need to fear here. What else? The forest keeps many secrets. The Leshy protects it. He is the guardian, but he is also wrathful, and sometimes the dead don't rest, especially those who died with pain or hatred. That evening, I found my grandfather's old journal beneath a loose floorboard. Its pages were yellowed, ink faded but still legible. He wrote of a curse on our family, a shadow that followed us because of an ancient sin, something about land taken unjustly, a betrayal that angered the spirits. As I read, the house seemed to grow colder, darker. The candle flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Then came the knocking. Slow, deliberate, at the back door. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks again. I froze. The knocking stopped. I dared not open the door. That night, I dreamt of the Rusalka. She reached out to me from beneath the dark water, her eyes pleading. "Help me," she whispered. I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the air. Outside, the wind howled. Over the next days, the hauntings escalated. I found strange symbols scratched into the wooden beams, smelled faint traces of sulfur and wet earth, and heard whispers just beyond comprehension. Once, I saw footprints in the mud, bare, small, and impossibly cold to the touch. Desperate for answers, I returned to the forest, clearing my grandfather mentioned in his journal. There, I found a small altar, covered in moss and animal bones, tied with ribbons and wildflowers. I laid down offerings of bread, salt, and candles, and recited the prayers written in the journal, a mixture of Christian and ancient Slavic rites. As I spoke, the air thickened. A figure emerged from the mist, the Leshy. He was not monstrous, but his presence was overwhelming, ancient and powerful. His eyes glowed amber in the gloom, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "You disturb what should be left alone," he said. I begged forgiveness, explaining I sought only peace for my family and release for the restless spirit. The Leshy studied me silently, then nodded. The mist receded, and the oppressive weight lifted. Returning home, I found the house brighter, warmer. The cold spots vanished. The knocking and whispers ceased. But the Rusalka's song still haunts the riverbank, carried on the wind. And sometimes when the moon is high and the forest is still, I swear I see pale eyes watching from the shadows. There are places where the veil between worlds is thin, where old spirits linger, bound by sorrow and rage. In Zeleny Lug, those spirits are not at rest, and neither, it seems, am I. Story the end.
Story number 3.
My grandfather's house sat on the edge of a thick birch forest in southern Belarus, just a few kilometers from the village of Vyazyanka. It wasn't modern by any stretch. No internet, no reliable cell signal, and in the winters the wood stove was the only source of heat. My family used it as a dacha, a quiet place to escape from the city during summers. But no one stayed there full-time anymore. After my grandfather died in 1994, the house mostly stood empty, visited only a few times a year. I hadn't been back since I was a child, but in the fall of 2018, I took a leave of absence from work after a burnout and decided to stay there for a while. I thought it would be a good place to rest, to write, maybe clear my head. My mother tried to dissuade me. She said the place gave her bad dreams now, that ever since her father died, something had changed there. I thought she was just being dramatic. When I arrived, the house was in better shape than I expected. Dusty, yes, and musty, but structurally sound. The old cabinets still held chipped porcelain cups. The curtains, yellowed with age, swayed gently, even when there was no breeze. I aired out the rooms, unpacked, and set myself up in the back bedroom, my grandfather's old room. At first, the days were peaceful. I hiked in the woods, cooked simple meals, and wrote in a notebook. I found it strangely satisfying to be off the grid. But by the third night, I noticed odd things. At first, it was the wind, or what I thought was wind. The sound wasn't like the rustling of leaves or branches. It was more rhythmic, like whispers carried from deep in the trees. Then came the tapping. It began on the 4th night. I was lying in bed, about to drift off when I heard it. Light tapping on the window pane. I sat up, heart racing, but told myself it was probably just a branch. I tried to ignore it. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. The next morning, I checked the outside of the window. No branches were anywhere near it. I went into the village for groceries later that day. When I mentioned I was staying in the old Ivanov place, the woman at the store gave me a strange look. That house? She asked, her voice dropping. You're alone? I nodded. She hesitated, then said, Just be careful near the woods at night. I asked her what she meant, but she only shook her head. The tapping didn't stop. It grew more frequent and came from different parts of the house. Sometimes it was the window in the kitchen, other times the front door. I never saw anyone. I started leaving lights on overnight, but that didn't help. Then one night I woke to a new sound. Footsteps. Not the creaking of old boards settling, but distinct, heavy steps moving slowly through the hallway. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped outside my bedroom door. I waited for the handle to turn. It didn't. The next morning, I found small, muddy footprints on the floor. They led from the front door to the hallway and stopped just outside my room. I hadn't been outside the previous day, and the floor had been cleaned before I went to bed. They were bare feet. Small, maybe the size of a child's. I told myself it must be someone messing with me, maybe a kid from the village playing a prank. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I bolted the front door and propped a chair under the handle. I closed the shutters on all the windows and lit every candle I could find. I even kept an old axe near the bed, more for comfort than anything else. At 2:41 a.m., the tapping started again. It came from the wall this time, not the window, the wall itself. It moved slowly from one side of the room to the other, like something or someone was inside the wall, dragging their fingers across it. Then came the whispering. It was faint, incomprehensible at first, but as I strained to hear, the words became clear. It was Belarusian, a dialect I only partly understood, but the tone chilled me more than the content. She took him. He cries in the trees. I froze. The whisper moved closer. It sounded like a woman's voice, low and cracked, like her throat was full of dirt. I snapped. I grabbed the axe, flung the door open, and turned on every light in the house. Nothing. No one. I stayed up until morning, trembling. The next day, I visited the village priest. He was old and nearly blind, but kind. I asked him if there had been any stories about my grandfather's house or the woods nearby. He didn't answer at first, just stared ahead and sighed. There are things in those trees, he said finally. Old things, spirits we used to respect, some we used to fear. He told me a story about the Lashachi, forest spirits who lured travelers off the path and replaced them with shadows. But there was one tale that stood out. He called it the child bride. In the early 1900s, a young girl had gone missing in those woods. Some said she was taken. Others believed her parents gave her to the forest to appease something. Her body was never found, but villagers claimed to hear her crying at night, tapping on windows, begging to be let in. You shouldn't have gone there alone, he told me, and you definitely shouldn't sleep in the grandfather's room. I asked why. He said, that was where she came last. That's where he saw her. My grandfather apparently had seen her. My mother never told me, but in the months before he died, he had confided in the priest that she came to him, a girl in a white dress, barefoot, muddy, face hidden by her long wet hair. She stood at the edge of the woods, sometimes closer, always watching. I left the priest's house shaken. That night, I didn't sleep in the bedroom. I laid down in the living room near the fire. Around midnight, the house grew unnaturally cold. The fire, which had been burning steadily, dimmed suddenly, like someone had thrown water on it. The shadows in the room grew longer. I heard the whisper again. Please, let me in. I'm so cold. I stood, clutching the axe, and slowly turned toward the sound. She was standing just outside the window. Her hand was pressed against the glass. Pale skin, blue lips, eyes wide and glassy. Her dress was torn and wet, and her feet were muddy. Her mouth moved silently, but I could hear the words inside my head. I'm alone, please. I screamed. I don't remember what I said. I think I cursed at her, shouted for her to leave. I ran to the window, but when I got there, she was gone. No footprints, no marks on the glass, nothing. The next day I left. I didn't pack. I just got in my car and drove. I didn't stop until I reached Minsk. I stayed with a friend and didn't go back. A week later, my mother called. The villagers had found the house open. The door was unlocked, the furniture overturned. The priest went with them to bless the place. In the kitchen, they found something that wasn't there before, a small handprint. On the ceiling, it was pressed into the wood, burned into it, like it had been seared there. My mother begged me to sell the house. I didn't hesitate. To this day, I don't know if what I saw was a ghost, a spirit, or something older, something darker, but I still hear her sometimes in my dreams or in those silent moments just before sleep. She taps, she whispers, and she's always just outside. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I had just finished my master's degree in ethnology at the University of Belgrade and was working on a research paper about rural Slavic beliefs regarding the dead. Most of my sources were interviews and old texts, but I wanted something different, something untouched, undocumented. That's how I found myself in the hills of southeastern Serbia, in a village so small it wasn't listed on any standard map. Its name was Vodnik, and it sat tucked into a pine-covered valley, its 30 or so houses scattered like broken teeth along a narrow path of cracked stone. A former professor of mine, Dr. Milan Vukovic, had told me about Vodnik during a late-night conversation over Slivovitz. He said it was a place the church forgot, a pocket of people who still left offerings for the dead, covered mirrors after a death, and believed in something older and colder than any saint. His father had grown up there, but had refused to return after his brother died under strange circumstances in the 1960s. I arranged to stay with an old couple, the Jivkovits, in exchange for helping them around the property and bringing goods from the nearest town every few days. When I arrived, they were waiting on the dirt path that passed for a road, Baba Lenka and Deda Rade. Both had faces carved deep with time, but their eyes were sharp. They welcomed me without ceremony, simply pointing to the guest room in the back of their small wooden house. It was humble but clean, with lace doilies on every surface and an icon of St. Nicholas watching me from above the bed. The first few days were uneventful. I helped carry firewood, milked goats, took notes, and interviewed a few of the villagers. Everyone was polite, but their answers were clipped, rehearsed. When I asked about death rituals or ghost beliefs, their eyes would flick to the woods or their mouths would shut completely. A few muttered, "Don't speak of such things," and walked away. It was frustrating. One afternoon, while helping Lenka hang dried herbs, I noticed a strange bundle tied with red string tucked into the rafters. It looked like bones, maybe a chicken's, and feathers bound together. I pointed to it. "Zashtita," she said firmly. "Protection." When I asked from what, she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "From the one who walks." That night I asked Rade what she meant. He stared into the fireplace for a long time before answering. "She means the Hodajucha Mrtva," he said. The walking dead. But not like in stories. Not rotting, not stupid. Something worse, something that remembers. I pressed him for details, but he refused to speak more. He just muttered a prayer and threw more wood into the fire. A few nights later, the temperature dropped sharply. I was writing in my notebook when I heard a sound, soft tapping on the window behind me. I turned quickly, heart kicking, but saw nothing, just pine trees swaying under moonlight. I chalked it up to nerves. The next night, the same thing, tapping, then scratching, like fingernails on wood. I opened the shutters and saw nothing but dark forest. On the third night, the sounds came again, this time accompanied by something worse, a voice. A woman's voice, low and hoarse, whispering in Serbian. "Pogledaj mi." Look at me. I slammed the window shut and didn't sleep. At breakfast the next morning, I told the Živkovics. Rade went pale and dropped his spoon. Lenka got up without a word and retrieved a bundle like the one I'd seen in the rafters. She hung it over my window and sprinkled something, ash maybe, on the windowsill. "No more questions," she said. "You came here to learn. Now you will." That evening, I was invited to something they called Ponochno Delo, the Midnight Act. I wasn't told what it was, just that I had to come and stay silent. I followed them into the woods at 11:30 p.m., our way lit only by a few old lanterns and the dull silver of the moon. After about 20 minutes, we reached a small clearing with an ancient-looking stone well at the center. Around it stood 7 people, all dressed in black. The air was deathly still. Lenka placed a bowl of milk and black bread beside the well. Another woman began to chant, something slow and rhythmic, not Serbian. It sounded older, colder. The others joined in. Then the forest responded. From the trees came a rustling that didn't match any wind. The trees weren't moving, but something was. The chanting stopped. The air thickened, and the hair on my arms rose. Then I saw her. She stepped into the clearing like a deer, silent and smooth. A woman, maybe 30, barefoot and wearing a thin white dress soaked with mud. Her head lolled slightly, as if her neck had trouble holding it up. Her face was grayish, her eyes empty pits, but her mouth was stitched shut with coarse black thread. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused. She approached the well, picked up the bowl of milk, and drank without using her hands. The milk poured down her chin and chest. Then she stood upright, looked directly at me, and began to tremble. The villagers chanted again, louder this time. She turned and vanished back into the woods, moving like a puppet with broken strings. We walked back in silence. Back at the house, Ride finally explained. She was a woman from the village long ago. Her name was Danica. She died in childbirth, but something in the burial went wrong. They say her husband did not keep watch the full 3 nights after her death, as custom demands. They buried her too soon. She returned. But not as herself. I asked why the mouth was stitched. He said, so she doesn't call others to follow. Over the next week, I became obsessed. I asked more questions, but the villagers grew colder. One day, a man named Petar approached me and said, if you keep asking, she'll come for you. And this time, she won't just drink milk. That night, I dreamed of her. She stood at the foot of my bed, head tilted, mouth bleeding through the black thread. She pointed to the forest. When I woke up, my feet were dirty and covered in pine needles. I decided to leave. I told the Zhivkovits I was done, that I had enough material. They didn't argue. As I packed, Lenka placed a small leather pouch in my hand. For protection, she said. Do not open it. Do not throw it away. I drove to the nearest town and checked into a motel. That night, while taking a shower, I noticed bruises on my thighs, small, round marks like finger imprints. My dreams were full of whispering and trees that bled when touched. I went back to Belgrade and tried to resume normal life. I buried myself in my thesis, but every few nights I'd hear tapping, first at the windows, then on the walls, then somehow inside the apartment. My girlfriend left me after waking to find me standing at the window, whispering in my sleep. I moved 3 times. I changed my phone number. I stopped writing, but nothing changed. She comes when it's cold. I've seen her in reflections. Once she was crouching on my kitchen counter. Another time she crawled across the ceiling like smoke. I burned the pouch once, just to see. The fire went out instantly. A week ago, I got a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the clearing in Vodinik. 7 figures in black, a pale woman in white at the center. On the back it read, "It's your turn to feed her." I haven't slept in 2 days. I keep hearing her voice, clearer now. No longer whispering, screaming, story the end.
Story number 5.
I had no intention of moving back to Belarus. Minsk had changed so much since I left as a teenager, and I had built my life in Warsaw. But when my father died unexpectedly last winter, I became the sole heir to his small dacha near the Polesia marshlands, a sagging wooden house nestled in a clearing just outside the village of Veselki. He'd lived there alone for nearly 20 years after retiring, refusing to move to the city despite my pleading. I hadn't seen him in over a year. Our relationship was strained, especially after my mother's death. He grew quiet, superstitious, and reclusive. His letters became short and rambling, often referencing strange dreams and noises outside his window at night. He mentioned seeing shadows in the woods, hearing his name whispered from the trees. I brushed it off as age, isolation, maybe dementia. I didn't want to believe it could be something more. I arrived on a damp March morning. The land was still thawing from winter. Dirty snow clung stubbornly to the trees, and the air was thick with fog. The dacha looked smaller than I remembered. The fence had partially collapsed, and the wood siding was spotted with mildew. The windows were dusty, and the front steps had sagged into the earth like tired bones. The village was barely alive. A dozen houses, most empty. The only shop was closed. I asked around about my father's death, but the few remaining locals avoided the topic. One old woman, whose name I never learned, grabbed my wrist when I asked about his final days. "He saw her," she whispered, "and once you see her, she sees you." I laughed nervously, but her eyes didn't blink. I should have listened. Inside the dacha, nothing had changed. My father's slippers still rested by the door. A pot of soup, dried and spoiled, sat on the stove. His coat hung on the hook. It felt like he had just stepped out for a walk. I found his journal on the kitchen table. The last few entries were scrawled and disjointed. She walks again, same as before. Long hair, white dress, only comes when the fog rises. The dreams are not dreams. She waits by the swamp. I tried to ignore her, but she knocks now. Every night. Knock, knock, knock. Last night she stood by the bed. Her face was missing. My skin prickled. I wanted to leave, to drive back to Warsaw and sell the place remotely. But something rooted me there. Guilt, perhaps. I felt I owed my father something. Maybe I wanted answers. The first night was quiet, eerily so. The wind didn't rustle the trees and no birds sang. I heard a knock at the back door around midnight. Just once. I froze in bed, holding my breath, convinced it was a branch or an animal, but in the morning I found a small, wet footprint on the kitchen floor. Barefoot. Human. I told myself I must have stepped in something, though I hadn't left the house. The next night, I dreamed of a girl in the woods. She was barefoot, hair soaking wet, eyes like pits of black water. She stood behind the window, her pale hand pressed to the glass, her mouth opening in slow, impossible horror. But no sound came out. I woke up gasping. My pillow was damp. Outside, the fog had returned. It wrapped the house like a shroud. I stared into it for a long time, half expecting to see her, and then I did. She was standing by the tree line, in a thin white dress, unmoving. I watched her for nearly 5 minutes. She didn't blink, didn't sway, just stood. And when I turned away and looked back, she was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I tried to leave the next day, but the car wouldn't start. No reason. Battery was fine. I called a mechanic from Pinsk, but the signal kept cutting out. When I finally got through, the man on the other end said he'd come by in the morning. That night, the knocking returned. 3 sharp knocks on the back door. Then silence. 5 minutes later, 3 more on the front door. Then the side window. Always in threes. I stayed in bed, clutching my phone like a weapon. The knocking came again. Closer. I thought I saw a shadow pass by the bedroom door. When I finally gathered the courage to check, no one was there. But the smell of wet earth filled the house. I found footprints again, leading from the back door through the kitchen and stopping at the hallway. They were small, a child's. I followed them with my phone's flashlight, heart pounding. They ended outside my bedroom door. I checked every lock. Everything was sealed. No signs of forced entry. The air grew thick and cold, and I began to hear whispering, faint and high-pitched, like a girl humming a lullaby. I tried to record it, but the moment I opened my camera, it stopped. The fog never lifted. The mechanic never came. On the 4th day, I went into the woods. I don't know why. Maybe I thought confronting it would stop it. I followed the old path toward the swamp where my father used to take me fishing as a boy. The water had risen with the snow melt, dark and still, like glass. I stood there for a while, waiting, and then I saw her again. She rose from the water without a ripple, as if gravity didn't apply to her. Her dress clung to her skin, soaked in gray. Her long hair hung like riverweed. Her eyes were black voids swallowing the morning light. She didn't speak, just stared. I backed away, tripped over a root, and scrambled back to the house. That night she came inside. I know how it sounds. I locked every door, every window, but around 2 a.m. I heard footsteps in the hall. Slow. Wet. They squelched on the wood. My bedroom door creaked. I saw the knob turn. I didn't move. She stood there. Not a ghost, not a hallucination. She was real, physical, dripping water onto the floor. Her mouth opened and a sound came out, high, fractured, like dozens of voices overlapping. "Why did you leave me?" I screamed. She vanished. I found old newspapers the next day in the attic. One article from 1983 told of a girl who drowned in the swamp. She was 7. Her name was Lita. She had wandered off during a foggy afternoon and was never found. Locals searched for days. Some said they heard her crying at night, but they gave up. Said the marsh had claimed her. I think my father saw her. I think she followed him. Haunted him. Now she haunts me. I don't know what she wants. I don't know how to stop her. I've tried priests. One came, briefly, from Brest. He spent 5 minutes inside the dasha and walked out pale and shaking. Refused to bless the house. He wouldn't even take payment. Just left. I sleep in the kitchen now, where the windows are small and the lights stay on. I hear her every night, the knocking, the singing. Sometimes I wake up and she's at the foot of my bed, just watching. Sometimes I wake up and she's not there, but the blankets are damp. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. I've tried to leave the village 4 times, but every road leads back. I don't mean that figuratively. I've driven in circles using GPS. No matter which direction I take, I end up at the swamp. I think I'm being kept here, like my father was, trapped. Last night I dreamed she was beside me, whispering in my ear. Her voice was hoarse, barely a rasp. She said something I didn't understand, something in Old Belarusian. I recorded it. I played it for a local historian from the university in Rudna. He said it was a warning. Buried but not gone, seen but not known, you are the last. I haven't been able to sleep since. She's here, now, always. Even as I write this, I feel her behind me. The lights flicker when I speak her name. I don't dare anymore. If you ever hear of a girl in white near the Polesia swamps, turn back. Don't speak to her. Don't follow her voice. She doesn't want peace. She wants company. And she waits. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
My mother used to tell me that certain things ran in the blood. Curses, if you believe in that sort of thing. She never explained much. Just little warnings said in passing, muttered under her breath while peeling potatoes or sewing torn clothes. Don't whistle at night. Don't sleep with a mirror facing you. Never bring wildflowers into the house after dark. She grew up in a small village in eastern Slovakia, tucked near the Tatras, and said there were old things in those woods, things that watched, listened, and remembered. I always thought it was superstition. Until I went there myself. I was 27 when my grandmother died. She lived in a stone cottage on the outskirts of a village called Lipovce, near a mountain road where tourists rarely went, and the locals all knew one another's names. My mother hadn't returned to that place in over 30 years. She never gave a reason. Just told me we were better off where we were, in Košice. But when Babka passed, someone had to go handle the house. My mother refused. She just handed me a worn envelope containing the deed, a rusted iron key, and a small wooden charm tied with red string. Take it, she said, but don't stay longer than you need to, and don't go in the cellar. I remember laughing. The charm looked like a child had carved it, an odd shape, maybe a bird or a tree, and the string looked old, frayed in places. Still, I packed it with my things, more for her peace of mind than anything else. I arrived in Lipovce on a Monday afternoon. The village was even smaller than I imagined, about 20 houses, a single market, and a crumbling chapel on a hill. The air was different, not cold exactly, but sharp, like something wet and buried deep beneath the ground. The house stood at the edge of the forest, its roof sagging, vines twisting up its walls like veins. It hadn't been lived in for a while. Dust coated everything inside. Cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners. But there were signs that someone had been there recently. A pot with dried herbs sat on the stove. The bed was made, and on the kitchen table was a plate, a spoon, and a small cup of tea that had gone completely black. I spent the first day cleaning. I didn't hear anything odd, not at first. Just the occasional creak of the floorboards or a draft slipping through the cracks. The cellar door, though, gave me pause. It was in the kitchen, behind a faded curtain. The wood was darker than the rest of the house, the iron handle cold to the touch. I didn't try to open it. I told myself it probably smelled awful down there anyway. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The silence was unnerving. Total. In the city, there's always some kind of noise, cars, sirens, neighbors. Here, even the birds seemed to sleep without a sound. I heard something around midnight, a faint knocking. Not at the front door. No, this was closer. Hollow, repetitive, like someone tapping their knuckles against a wooden surface. I sat up, heart thudding, but it stopped after a few seconds. Probably the pipes, I thought. Old house. The next day I spoke with one of the neighbors, an old woman named Anka. She was sitting outside her house, peeling apples and drying tobacco leaves. "You're Zuzana's grandson?" she asked without looking up. I nodded. She was a strong woman, stubborn, stayed here long after the rest of her family left, said the house needed to be watched. Watched? I repeated. She nodded. Your family has always been keepers, since before the war, since before the roads came. That house, it sits on something old, something buried. Your great-grandmother used to say it was a mouth. A mouth? She glanced at me then, her eyes cloudy but sharp. A mouth that feeds when it's ignored. I laughed nervously. That sounds like a fairy tale. Maybe. She popped a slice of apple into her mouth and chewed slowly. But your Babka never stopped watching. Every night before bed, she would lock the cellar and place the charm on the door. I thought of the wooden piece in my bag, still wrapped in the red string. Keep it close, Anka said, as if reading my thoughts. And if you hear someone knocking, don't answer. Even if they call your name. That night, I put the charm under my pillow. I didn't believe it would do anything, but I figured I'd humor the old traditions. It was after midnight when I heard it again. Knocking. This time it came from the floor beneath my bed. Not loud, just soft, deliberate taps like someone knocking gently from inside the house's bones. I froze. Then came the voice. Tomasz, it whispered. It sounded like my mother. Tomasz, open the door. I didn't move. My mouth was dry. I lay there for hours, listening. The knocking continued, irregular, sometimes close, sometimes farther, but the voice stayed by the cellar. By morning, the charm under my pillow had snapped in half. The string was gone. I told myself it was stress, maybe mold in the house messing with my head. I opened the windows, scrubbed the floors, even walked through the woods to clear my mind. The villagers avoided my gaze. One man even crossed himself when I passed. The next night, I dreamed of the house, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with people, gray-skinned, hollow-eyed, sitting at the kitchen table, staring. In the dream, they all turned to me at once, mouths opening, black and endless. I woke up to the sound of the cellar door opening. Not fully, just a creak, the groan of wood shifting. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the kitchen. The door was ajar. The charm, the one I'd found broken, was now on the floor, burnt at the edges. Something was breathing down there. I didn't look. I couldn't. I shut the door and pushed the heaviest chair I could find against it. The next morning, I drove to the chapel and spoke with the priest. He was an old man with thin hands and a white collar stained yellow at the edges. When I told him about the cellar, he sighed and rubbed his eyes. She warned me, he said. Who? Your babka. She came here last winter, said the barrier was weakening, asked for holy water. I gave her what I could, but she said it wasn't enough anymore. Enough for what? He looked me dead in the eye. For what your family buried. He wouldn't say more, just told me to leave, to burn the house if I could. It doesn't matter anymore, he said. The old protections are broken. That night, the knocking didn't stop. It started at midnight. It came from the walls, the floors, even the ceiling. It moved like it was searching. Something pressed against the windows, dark shapes like fingers smearing across the glass. The lights flickered, then died, and then the door burst open, not the front door. The cellar. It opened with a moan, and something stepped out. I didn't see it fully. Just a shadow, long and jagged, crawling along the wall like smoke. It whispered my name over and over, but it wasn't my mother's voice anymore. It was deeper, thirstier. I ran. I don't remember how I got to the car, how I managed to drive with my hands shaking, but I didn't stop until I hit the main road and saw the lights of the next town. I stayed in a motel that night, shaking under the covers. I never went back. The house still stands. No one lives there. The villagers won't go near it. Sometimes tourists wander in, but they don't stay long. Some say they hear tapping at the windows. Others say the house smells like soil, damp and fresh, like something just dug up. My mother died 2 years ago. I found her journals while clearing her things. In one entry, dated back to 1972, she wrote, "The mouth is still hungry. I hear it in my dreams. Susanna says it cannot be moved, only watched. We are not protectors. We are feeders." I don't know what she meant. I don't want to know. But sometimes late at night, I dream of the house. I dream of that knocking, patient and steady. And sometimes I wake up and hear it under my bed. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
It was in the summer of 1998 when my friend Pavel decided to move back to his family's ancestral home in a small village near the Carpathian Mountains in western Ukraine. Pavel was always fascinated by the old stories his grandmother told him as a child, stories full of forest spirits, vengeful dead, and strange disappearances. His family house had been empty since the late 1970s after his grandfather passed away, but Pavel believed that living there would reconnect him to his roots and give him a peaceful place to write his poetry. The house was a traditional wooden structure, perched at the edge of the village, bordering the dense forest known locally as Chorny Lis, the Black Forest. Locals avoided the forest, especially after dusk. They whispered of strange lights and eerie sounds, but Pavel dismissed these as superstition. The house itself was in rough shape. The roof sagged, windows were boarded up, and the floorboards creaked with age. But the surrounding land was fertile and beautiful, with wildflowers and tall oaks casting long shadows in the evening. Pavel invited me to visit a few weeks after he settled in. I had always enjoyed his stories and wanted to see the place that inspired so much of his writing. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was the silence. Not just the absence of noise, but a heavy stillness that seemed to press against the eardrums. Even the birds were quiet. The village itself was nearly deserted. Many young people had moved away for work, leaving mostly the elderly behind. That evening, as we sat outside near the porch, the sun dipping behind the hills, Pavel told me about the local legends. He spoke of the Mavka, a spirit of the forest, a woman who could appear as beautiful or terrifying, luring men into the woods only to vanish without a trace. The old villagers believed the Mavka was the soul of a girl who had died before her time, trapped between worlds seeking company or revenge. Some said she sang at night, a voice so haunting it could freeze your blood. I laughed nervously, but Pavel's eyes were serious. That night I slept in the small attic room, the window open to let in the fresh mountain air. Around midnight I woke to a faint singing. It was soft, a woman's voice, drifting like a lullaby on the wind. I sat up, my heart pounding. The song was sad, slow, and oddly hypnotic. I wanted to find the source, but felt rooted to the bed. The next morning, Pavel said he'd heard the singing too. He tried to explain it away, an owl, a wind through the trees, but I could see the unease in his expression. Days passed, and the experiences grew stranger. Doors creaked open on their own. Cold drafts swirled inside rooms sealed tight. At times, we heard footsteps on the porch, though no one was there. Once, Pavel swore he saw a pale woman standing at the edge of the forest, her hair tangled, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. When he called out, she vanished. One afternoon, while exploring the forest near the house, Pavel found an old, crumbling grave. The wooden cross was weathered and half buried in moss. The name was illegible, but next to it lay a small carved doll, cracked and worn. He brought it home as a curiosity, though I told him it felt wrong. That night, the house seemed alive with noises. The doll appeared on the kitchen table in the morning, though Pavel insisted he hadn't moved it. The singing grew louder, now coming from within the walls. Shadows flickered at the corners of rooms. We decided to visit the village elder, Baba Lida, known for her knowledge of folk traditions and healing. She listened carefully as Pavel described what was happening. "You disturbed her resting place," she said gravely. "The girl in the grave, she was not buried with peace. The doll is a link. She reaches for what was taken." She gave Pavel a small bundle of herbs and told him to burn them in the house to cleanse the spirit and ask for forgiveness. That night, we burned the herbs near the fireplace. The smoke filled the room, thick and bitter. The singing stopped, but only for a while. At dawn, we found scratches on the front door, at deep and fresh, as if something clawed to get in. Pavel's health began to decline. He grew pale and withdrawn. He told me he dreamed of the girl, her face a mask of sorrow and anger. She whispered promises and threats, warning him to leave or be trapped forever. One evening, as a storm rolled in, the house shook with howling winds. The power went out, plunging us into darkness. I lit candles while Pavel tried to stay calm. Suddenly, a loud crash came from upstairs, the floorboards breaking. We rushed up to find the attic door open. Inside, the old cradle from Pavel's childhood stood rocking violently, though the room was empty. The doll lay broken on the floor, its face shattered. That night, Pavel decided he could not stay any longer. We packed what we could and left before dawn, the forest seeming to close in behind us. He never returned. Years later, I heard from a friend that the house burned down, mysteriously, during a harsh winter. The villagers whispered that the Mavka finally claimed her territory, and the spirit of the restless girl was at peace once more. Sometimes, when the wind howls through the mountains, people say they still hear a faint, sorrowful singing drifting from the black forest, warning those who dare to listen. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was the spring of 2007 when I moved back to my ancestral village in western Ukraine. After years in the city, working as a journalist in Lviv, I felt drained and wanted to reconnect with my roots. The village, a small cluster of weathered wooden houses and rolling fields, had been home to my family for generations. My grandmother still lived there in the old house left to her by my great-grandfather. When she passed away the previous winter, I decided to stay in the house for a while, to sort through her things and find some peace. The house stood at the end of a narrow dirt road near the edge of a dense forest. It was built in the late 19th century with thick logs, low ceilings, and a large stone hearth that once warmed the family through brutal winters. The scent of pine and damp earth hung heavy around it, mixing with the faint decay of old wood and forgotten memories. From the first night, I felt an unease I couldn't shake. The house groaned with age, the walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards whispered beneath my feet. Outside, the forest pressed close, dark and silent except for the occasional rustle of animals unseen. I told myself these were normal sounds, part of living in the countryside, and tried to ignore the prickling feeling on the back of my neck. But the nights grew harder. On the second evening, as the wind howled outside, I heard something. Footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. Slow, deliberate, heavy steps. I assumed it was an animal or the wind causing the door to move, but when I went to check, there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, the old wooden floor cold under my hand. A few nights later, I awoke to a faint tapping at the window. It wasn't rain or tree branches. It was precise, rhythmic, almost like someone knocking. When I looked out, there was nothing but darkness and the gleam of the moon on the wet ground. I shivered and pulled the curtains closed. I began to dig into the family history, hoping to distract myself. In the village archives and from elderly neighbors, I learned a story my grandmother never shared. During World War II, my great-grandfather's house was the site of a tragedy. A partisan fighter, a young woman named Katerina, was captured and executed by the occupying forces in the nearby forest. She had been a close friend of the family, a girl known for her fierce spirit and kindness. According to the villagers, her spirit never left the forest's edge. They said sometimes at night she could be heard crying for help or tapping on windows, searching for shelter. I thought it was just legend. But as days passed, strange things escalated. One evening, I was writing in the kitchen when the candle flickered violently. The flame stretched upward as if something invisible reached for it. Then the hearth's logs began to crackle, though I had not stoked the fire. A cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candle, plunging me into darkness. The whispers began then, soft, urgent, in Ukrainian. I caught fragments. Help me. Don't forget me. The forest keeps me. I felt tears on my cheek, but wasn't crying. The room grew colder, the shadows deeper. I stood, heart pounding, and spoke aloud. Who's there? What do you want? Silence, then a faint sob. Over the next few nights, I started seeing her. A figure in white, with tangled dark hair covering her face, standing just beyond the tree line, staring toward the house. Sometimes she would disappear when I blinked. Other times I saw her in reflections, a pale shape behind me in the kitchen window or standing at the foot of the bed. The villagers warned me again. She's lost, bound by sorrow. You must help her rest. I didn't know how. One afternoon, I visited the forest with a local elder, a woman named Helena who had known my grandmother. She told me about an old ritual, a way to ease wandering spirits, offering them remembrance and peace through sacred rites and a small grave marker near the site of their passing. We walked deep into the woods to a clearing marked by a decayed wooden cross and stones half swallowed by moss. Helena said this was where Katerina was believed to have died. That night, I placed a candle and some wildflowers by the cross, said a prayer, and asked for her forgiveness. The wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of pine and earth. I thought it was over. But on the seventh night, the house shook violently in the early hours, like a great storm had crashed against it. The windows rattled. The door slammed open. I woke to a scream, piercing, anguished, and human. I rushed to the hallway to find the door swinging on its hinges, but no one there. The shadows seemed to twist and pulse. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw her, Katerina, but her face no longer hidden, pale and gaunt, eyes hollow and accusing. She reached out, fingers elongated and cold as ice. "Why did you forget me?" she whispered, voice broken. I fell back, trembling. "I didn't forget. I'm trying to help." She faded slowly, but the air stayed heavy with grief. The following day, I spoke to the village priest. He gave me holy water and an old icon, instructing me to bless the house and the forest clearing. That evening, I performed the rites alone, sprinkling water around the rooms, praying in the dim candlelight. The house seemed to sigh, the oppressive weight lifting just a little. At dawn, the forest was quiet. I never saw her again. But sometimes, on cold, cold nights when the wind carries the scent of pine and rain, I swear I hear a faint tapping on the window and a whisper on the breeze, soft as a prayer. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
The village of Krivi Vir was not on any tourist map. Nestled deep in the Carpathian foothills of Serbia, it was the kind of place people spoke about only in whispers, especially during long winter nights by the fire. My grandmother often told me stories about it when I was a child, tales of restless spirits, old curses, and unquiet dead. Those stories seemed like folklore back then, just myths to scare children into obedience. But years later, when I was 29 and working as a forest ranger, I learned the truth in a way no one ever should. I was assigned to patrol the borderlands near Krivi Vir for the government's Environmental Protection Agency. The forests there were thick, tangled, and ancient. Nobody had lived in Krivi Vir proper for decades, not since the old village was abandoned after the Second World War. Yet shepherds and hunters still wandered the woods, and locals from nearby towns warned me to keep away from certain places. I took their warnings lightly, thinking they were just old superstitions. My first night in Krivi Vir was eerily quiet. I had a small cabin near the ruins of the village with a single oil lamp for light and a wood stove for warmth. The walls were thin and the wind howled like a wild animal outside. I was alone. The moon was full, casting pale light through the window. At around midnight, I was woken by a soft sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, coming from outside. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. The forest was still except for the crunching of the underbrush. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. I chalked it up to animals and went back inside. The next morning, I met an old man at the nearby town market. His name was Milorad, and he warned me bluntly to leave the forest at night, especially near the old village ruins. There are things there you cannot understand, he said. The dead do not rest in Krivi Vir. I asked what he meant, but he only shook his head and spat into the dirt. Listen to the stories, he said. Don't be a fool. That day, as I patrolled the area, I found the remains of an old stone well near the center of the ruins. Around it, the ground was disturbed as if someone had been digging recently. Strange symbols were scratched into the stone, circles and lines resembling ancient Slavic runes, but twisted and unfamiliar. At night, I was again disturbed by sounds, this time voices, faint chanting in an old Slavic dialect, barely audible on the wind. The voices seemed to come from the well itself. One night, curiosity overcame me. I decided to descend into the well. It was deeper than I thought, dark and cold. My flashlight barely penetrated the thick shadows. Halfway down, I saw something glimmering on the walls, old bones, tied with strips of cloth stained red. A sudden cold swept over me, and I heard the chanting again, closer this time. I scrambled out and ran back to the cabin, heart pounding. That night, I dreamt of a woman. She was young, with long dark hair and pale skin. Her eyes were black holes, and her mouth was sewn shut with thick thread. She stood at the edge of the well, reaching for me with blood-stained hands. I woke up screaming. The next day, I visited the town library to research the village. There, in a dusty book, I found an old record. In 1943, during the war, the villagers of Krivi Vir had been accused of witchcraft by occupying forces. Many were killed or fled, and the village was abandoned. One woman, Danica, was said to have cursed the land before her death, promising that the dead would rise to guard their secrets. As night fell again, I was no longer alone in my cabin. Shadows moved outside, and the faint sound of chanting filled the air. My oil lamp flickered and died. In the pitch black, I heard whispers, calling my name in a voice that was both pleading and accusing. Suddenly, the door burst open. A figure stood there, the woman from my dreams. Her mouth was sewn shut, but I heard her voice clear as day in my mind. You came for the truth. I ran, but the forest seemed endless. The chanting followed me, growing louder, until I tripped and fell near the well. The cold air pulled at me, and I saw hands reaching out from the water, pale, skeletal fingers grasping. I screamed and woke up in my cabin at dawn. The villagers found me the next day, delirious and muttering about the dead. I left Krivi Vir that morning, never to return. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I still hear the chanting, calling me back to the well, to the village that refuses to die. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The wind howled through the dense pine forest, carrying with it a cold that seemed unnatural for early autumn. It was the kind of cold that seeped beneath your skin, settling in your bones. My cousin Ivan and I had arrived in the small village of Zalesye just before dusk. The village was tucked away in the depths of western Ukraine, near the border with Poland, surrounded by ancient forests that had stood for centuries, guarding secrets no one dared to speak aloud. Ivan's grandfather, whom we had never met, had recently passed away, leaving behind a weathered wooden house on the edge of the village. Ivan inherited it, and since he was eager to get away from the city for a while, we decided to spend a week there, clearing out the house and perhaps learning more about his family's past. The villagers were a quiet lot, wary of strangers, but not openly hostile. At the small market in the center of town, when Ivan asked about the house, the old woman behind the counter gave a grim look and lowered her voice. "You will want to be careful," she said. "The forest there is old, older than the village. The house, it holds memories, and some things should be left undisturbed." I laughed it off, but Ivan's face tightened. He said nothing more. The house stood at the edge of the village, its wooden walls gray with age, the roof sagging under years of neglect. Around it, the forest pressed close, dark and silent except for the occasional rustle of branches. We entered, the floorboards groaning beneath our feet. Inside, the air smelled of dust and damp wood. The rooms were filled with old furniture covered in sheets and piles of belongings that looked untouched for decades. We began sorting through the belongings, uncovering faded photographs, yellowed letters written in Cyrillic, and a thick leather-bound book, a diary, which Ivan found tucked away under loose floorboards in the bedroom. That night, after dinner, we sat by the fire, the house creaking around us. Ivan opened the diary carefully. The pages were brittle, but the ink still visible. The entries were written by Ivan's great-grandmother, Katerina. She wrote of her life during the war, of the harsh winters and the fear that hung over the village. But then the entries grew strange. She wrote of a presence in the forest, a woman in white who appeared at night, standing silently among the trees. The villagers called her Baba Bona, a forest spirit, neither alive nor dead, who wandered the woods in sorrow. Katerina wrote that Baba Bona was once a young woman named Olena, who had vanished one winter, lost in the forest, never to return. Some believed the spirit sought revenge, others that she sought company, but all agreed she was dangerous. That night, as I lay in the creaky old bed, I could hear the wind pressing against the window, whispering through the cracks. The shadows from the moonlight cast strange shapes on the walls. Suddenly, a soft tapping came from outside the window. I froze. The tapping came again. 3 taps, then silence. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but sleep would not come. In the morning, Ivan found strange footprints in the mud just outside the house, small, bare, and wet, though it hadn't rained. We joked nervously about the spirit, but there was a growing unease. That afternoon, while exploring the attic, I found an old wooden chest. Inside were more letters and photographs. One photo showed a young woman in a white dress standing at the edge of the forest, her face blurred as if moving. Ivan shivered when he saw it. As evening approached, the village grew quiet. The sun dipped behind the treetops and the cold deepened. We ate in silence, then retired early and both of us uneasy. At midnight, a low moaning sound drifted through the house, like wind through hollow trees, but mournful and human. Then came the knocking, soft, deliberate, on the back door. Ivan whispered, "Don't open it." The knocking stopped. Minutes later, the window by my bed rattled, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. I stared into the blackness, heart pounding. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, out in the forest beyond the house, a faint white glow appeared, drifting slowly among the trees. Ivan grabbed a flashlight, and we cautiously stepped outside. The glow moved deeper into the woods. We followed, careful not to stray from the path. The forest seemed alive with shadows, the trees bending as if watching us. Then suddenly, the glow stopped near a cluster of ancient oaks. There, standing just beyond the tree line, was a woman dressed in white. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging over her face. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her eyes were dark, empty pools. A cold dread settled over me. Ivan whispered an old prayer in Ukrainian, and the woman vanished, leaving only the mist and silence behind. We ran back to the house, locking every door and window. For the next days, the presence intensified. The knocking continued nightly, always 3 taps. Sometimes soft singing echoed outside, a lullaby in a language neither of us understood. One morning, Ivan disappeared. I woke to find the bed empty. His things were gone. Outside, the footprints led into the forest and stopped at the edge of the swamp nearby. I searched, shouting his name into the woods. No reply. At night, the singing turned to cries. I realized I was alone. Then came a final message left on the kitchen table in Ivan's handwriting. She calls me. I must go. I never saw him again. I left the village the next day, but the road seemed endless, twisting through the forest like a labyrinth. I still hear the tapping sometimes, and sometimes on foggy nights I see her, Baba Bona, standing just beyond the tree line, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 11.
In the early 2000s, my uncle Yuri bought a small derelict dacha deep in the woods near the village of Dubrova in western Ukraine. The property had been abandoned since Soviet times, with broken windows, a half-collapsed barn, and trees growing too close to the walls. The house stood on a patch of land barely reachable by car, especially in spring when the mud turned the roads into pits. He'd gotten it for practically nothing. The plan was to fix it up slowly and use it for hunting trips or summers away from the city. I was 19 the first time I went with him. Yuri had asked me to help clean up and carry supplies from his old Volga. I remember the first moment I saw the house. It looked like it was sagging in on itself, as though tired of standing. Tall pine trees surrounded it so thickly that sunlight barely broke through even during the day. There was a strange silence in that forest. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that makes your ears ring. The villagers had warned him, of course. They always do. In these parts, there's no shortage of old tales and quiet glances. They'd said things like, "That place never keeps people," or "It's not good land, it drinks sorrow." But Yuri laughed it off. He was practical to a fault, and anything that couldn't be seen or measured didn't matter to him. We arrived just before dusk. The place stank of mildew, and the air inside the house was still, like something had been holding its breath for years. I remember the heavy creaking as we pushed the door open. Mice scurried under old rugs, and dust swirled in thick clouds. He told me to start cleaning while he fetched firewood from a shed behind the house. I swept and opened the windows, letting in what little air could break through the dense woods. It was only when I went upstairs to check the rooms that I noticed something strange. The second floor had 3 rooms, all empty except for one. The farthest room had an old wooden cradle sitting in the middle of the floor. It looked hand-carved, beautifully made, but worn with age. A faded blanket still lay folded inside it. I don't know why, but it filled me with unease. I left the room quickly, not wanting to touch anything. That night, we made a fire in the stove and cooked canned food. We sat on old chairs under dim lantern light, sipping vodka. Yuri talked about how great the place would be once we got it cleaned up. He didn't seem to notice the cold that seeped through the walls or the odd groaning sounds the house made in the dark. I tried to ignore them too. We both slept in the downstairs room. It was safer than venturing back upstairs. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I couldn't explain, like soft creaking wood, rhythmic, like something rocking. I thought maybe it was the wind outside or maybe a tree limb against the wall. But when I sat up, I could hear it more clearly. It was upstairs. The cradle. The sound was unmistakable now. A slow, deliberate creak, back and forth. I lay frozen. The fire had long gone out and the room was black. I could hear Yuri snoring beside me. I didn't move until morning. When I finally told Yuri, he scoffed. "Old wood," he said. "Mice. You city kids scare easy." But that day I went back to the room. The cradle was still there, but now the blanket was unfolded, hanging halfway out of it like someone had pulled it. I stared at it, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I didn't touch it. The next night, we tried to fix the generator. While Yuri worked on it outside, I stayed in the house. I heard whispering then. I was in the kitchen, and it came from upstairs, soft, urgent, a woman's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but I could tell it wasn't the wind. I called out, but no one answered. When Yuri came back in, I told him again. This time he looked uneasy. Probably some animal, he muttered. Maybe an owl. But he didn't look convinced. That evening I heard him walking around the house. He kept going back to the stairs and standing there, looking up like he expected something. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was starting to feel it too. The third night is when things turned. We'd built a fire and tried to ignore the cold. We drank more than usual. I went to sleep on the floor again, but Yuri stayed up, poking the fire. I must have drifted off, but I was pulled awake by the sound of footsteps upstairs. Heavy, slow. I sat up, heart pounding. Yuri heard it too. He grabbed the axe he kept by the stove and motioned for me to stay quiet. We listened. The footsteps moved across the floor above us, then paused. Then we heard a baby crying. It was faint but clear. Not loud like a newborn scream, but soft, broken, like a baby who'd cried too long and didn't have the strength anymore. I looked at Yuri. His face was white. We crept to the base of the stairs. The crying continued, echoing faintly through the floorboards. Then something else, a lullaby, a voice humming, low, tuneless, like someone who had sung the same song 1,000 times and forgotten the melody. I'd never heard anything so unnatural. Yuri suddenly shouted, "Who's there?" and stomped up the stairs. I begged him not to go, but he didn't listen. I followed him halfway, my legs trembling. He threw open the door to the cradle room and stood frozen. The cradle was rocking. No one was in the room. The blanket lay on the floor beside it. A cold wind blew from the open window, even though we had closed it that morning. Yuri didn't say a word. He backed out slowly and shut the door. That night, we didn't sleep. We sat by the fire with the lights on, listening. Nothing else happened, but neither of us dared to go upstairs again. The next morning, Yuri told me to pack up. We were leaving. As we drove away, he told me something he hadn't mentioned before. The land the dacha sat on had belonged to a woman named Anzala, a midwife during the Stalin years. She'd lived alone in the woods, away from the village. They said she had helped women in secret, those who didn't want their children. Some said she buried the babies herself. Others said they heard crying in the trees at night. After the war, she disappeared. Just vanished. The house stood empty until the 1960s when a family moved in. They didn't stay long. Over the years, at least 4 different families had bought the property. None of them stayed more than a few months. Yuri had laughed when he heard the story, thought it was village gossip. Now he wasn't so sure. I didn't go back, but Yuri did. Once more, alone. He wanted to finish boarding up the windows and maybe get some of his tools. He stayed one night. When he returned to the city, he was pale and quiet. I asked him what happened, but he only said, "It doesn't want to be forgotten." He never spoke of it again. A few years later, the house burned down. The locals say it was lightning. But the strange part is, there was no storm that night. The house was completely consumed. Even the stone foundation cracked. The fire didn't spread to the trees. It didn't touch the grass 10 feet away. It was as if something had chosen to end it. But even now, when you go near that patch of land, people say they hear things. Whispers in the trees, a cradle creaking, and sometimes just at dusk, a faint lullaby no one remembers the tune to. Story the end.
Story number 12.
It started the day I inherited my great-uncle's old house in a village deep in the Carpathians. I never met the man. He died before I was born, but my father always warned me about that part of the family. "Strange blood," he said once, eyes hard. "Better stay away." But when the letter arrived informing me of the inheritance, curiosity and a stubborn desire to prove him wrong pulled me there. The village was called Zborov, nestled in a forgotten valley where the road ended in dirt and gravel. The few locals I saw eyed me with suspicion, clutching their coats tighter against the cold wind that smelled of pine and something else, something like damp earth and old graves. The house itself stood at the edge of the woods, an old wooden structure blackened by centuries of rain and snow. The windows were shuttered, the garden wild and overgrown with nettles and thorn bushes. I arrived just before dusk, the sun slipping behind jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the forest. The door creaked open easily, revealing a dark interior smelling of rot and dust. Inside, time had stopped. A thick layer of grime coated every surface, and the air was heavy and cold. I explored cautiously, the wooden floorboards groaning underfoot. The walls were lined with faded photographs of stern-faced ancestors, eyes seeming to follow me wherever I went. On the kitchen table lay a broken ceramic cup, its shards scattered as if a sudden force had shattered it long ago. That first night, the wind outside howled through the cracks, making the house groan and sigh. I tried to sleep, but the silence was broken by faint scratching sounds, soft like nails on wood, coming from the cellar door. The cellar was a dark trapdoor beneath a heavy rug in the hallway. I'd been warned by the letter's postscript, "Do not enter the cellar after sunset." But curiosity gnawed at me. Around midnight, I crept down, flashlight in hand. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of damp stone and something else, metallic and coppery, like blood. The light flickered, revealing ancient tools hanging on the walls, rusted sickles, a scythe with a cracked handle, and strange symbols carved deep into the wood. Then I saw it. A small pile of bones on the floor, bleached white. And above them, written in what looked like dried blood, words in Old Church Slavonic, "Nechist hodit sredi nas," the unclean walks among us. A sudden cold rush made me stumble back upstairs. I locked the cellar door, heart pounding, and tried to convince myself it was some sick prank or old superstition. But that night, I dreamed of a woman with hollow eyes, pale skin stretched taut over her cheekbones, long black hair tangled and matted. She whispered in a voice like wind through dead leaves, calling my name in a language I didn't understand. The days that followed only grew worse. The villagers stopped answering my questions. One old man warned me, "That house is cursed. Your uncle knew. We all knew. The forest outside holds things that do not die." At night, the scratching returned. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps pacing the upstairs hallway, but when I checked, the rooms were empty. Mirrors cracked spontaneously. Doors slammed on their own. Shadows moved where there should have been none. One evening, I found an old journal in the attic, bound in cracked leather. The entries were written in a hurried scrawl, mixing Slovak with cryptic runes. My uncle spoke of a darkness that had settled over the family, a debt paid in blood generations ago. He mentioned a ritual, a sacrifice made to the Leshy, the forest spirit, to protect the village from worse things, creatures that dwelled beneath the earth in the roots of the trees. The Leshy is a keeper, one entry read, but it demands balance. If the debt is unpaid, it takes. I began to feel watched, not just by the house, but by the forest beyond. One night, drawn by a strange compulsion, I wandered outside into the woods under a pale moon. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, branches twisting like fingers. Suddenly a chill gripped me, and I heard breathing, not my own, but something deep and ragged. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall and thin, face obscured by tangled hair and moss. Its eyes glowed faintly green, reflecting the moonlight. It raised a hand, pointing toward the village, then vanished like smoke. I ran back to the house, locking every door and window. That night, the knocking came. Not at the door, but on the walls. Slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The voice followed, low and guttural, speaking in the old tongue. I remembered the charm my grandmother gave me as a child, a carved piece of elder wood tied with red thread. I found it in my bag and placed it on the windowsill. The knocking slowed, then stopped. But the peace was brief. On the last night, I awoke to a terrible scream. It echoed from the cellar, rising to a crescendo before cutting off abruptly. I knew I had to face whatever was down there. With trembling hands, I opened the cellar door. The air was thick with decay. I stepped down into the darkness, flashlight barely piercing the black. At the bottom, I found a fresh grave dug into the earth, filled with wildflowers and a freshly turned mound of soil. Then behind me, a cold breath on my neck. I turned to see the woman from my dreams, her hollow eyes full of sorrow and rage. She whispered, "You are one of us now." The cellar door slammed shut above me. I was trapped. The next morning, the villagers found the house empty. No sign of me, only the broken charm on the windowsill, the faint echo of a woman's voice carried by the wind. The forest holds its secrets, and some debts never end. Story the end.
Story number 13.
I grew up in a small village nestled deep within the Carpathian foothills, where the forests stretch endlessly and the nights are darker than anywhere else I've known. The village, called Dembnik, is surrounded by legends older than memory, whispered from one generation to the next. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were carried like shadows beneath the trees. My family lived in a wooden house on the outskirts of the village, right beside the old cemetery. That cemetery was no ordinary resting place. It was said to be cursed, the soil soaked with restless spirits. The elders warned us children never to wander there after sunset, but curiosity is hard to resist. When I was about 15, the summer after I finished school, something happened that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It began on a sweltering July afternoon. I was helping my grandfather, Janek, repair a broken fence along the edge of the property. He was a wiry man, full of old customs and tales that seemed like they belonged to another world. As we worked, he paused and pointed toward the forest line. "See those trees, Kuba? That's where you don't go alone. That forest remembers. It watches." I nodded, half listening, thinking of the songs I had heard about the Rusalka and the Leshy, spirits of water and forest who could be kind or cruel depending on the day. Janek never liked to talk much about the things in the woods, but his eyes would darken when he did. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, I decided to walk into the forest. Not far, just to the edge where the river bends and the willow trees dip their long fingers into the water. I had heard from older kids that if you sat quietly by the riverbank, you might hear the Rusalki singing, their voices weaving between the reeds like a warning or a call. I walked alone, the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves underfoot my only companions. When I reached the river, the air felt cooler, thick with a strange, sweet scent, like wet earth mixed with wildflowers and something faintly metallic. I sat down on a moss-covered stone and waited. At first, there was only silence. Then, soft and distant, I heard it. A melody, haunting and pure, carried on the wind. It was a woman's voice, lilting and sorrowful, but so beautiful it made my skin crawl. The song was not like any lullaby I had ever heard. It spoke of loss and longing, of lives cut short and promises broken. Suddenly, I felt eyes on me. I turned sharply, but the forest was empty, except for the swaying branches and the shimmer of fireflies. The singing stopped. I hurried home, the voice echoing in my ears. That night, I barely slept. I told my grandfather what I had heard, and he just shook his head. Rusalki are spirits of the drowned. They lure the living to join them beneath the water. You must be careful. Days passed, but the feeling of being watched lingered. My mother warned me not to speak of it, that the forest had its own rules. Strange things began happening around the house, shadows moving just beyond sight, whispering in a language no one alive spoke. At night, I would hear footsteps circling the house, slow and deliberate, but when I looked, no one was there. One night, I awoke to the sound of scratching at my bedroom window. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw a pale face pressed against the glass, a woman with hollow eyes and wet hair hanging like seaweed. She smiled, showing teeth too sharp to be human, and vanished before I could scream. I ran to my grandfather's room, but he was gone. Outside, the air was thick with fog, curling around the trees like fingers reaching for me. The next morning, the villagers told me that Janek had disappeared. His bed was cold, the door open, and no sign of struggle. The only clue was a trail of wet footprints leading from the house into the forest. Fear gripped the village. We organized searches, but no trace of him was found. In the following weeks, more people vanished, farmers, children, even the priest. Each time a strange song was heard nearby, and footprints leading into the forest, never returning. I tried to stay away, but the forest seemed to call me, whispering my name when the wind blew through the trees. One evening, driven by desperation, I entered the woods with a lantern and a cross. I walked for hours, deeper than ever before, until I came upon a clearing with an ancient stone well, covered in vines. There the air was thick and cold. I heard the song again, clearer now, a lament filled with pain and rage. Suddenly from the darkness, a figure rose from the well's depths. A woman, pale and dripping, eyes black as night, her hands reaching out. I raised the cross and screamed. The figure hesitated, then vanished into the mist. I ran back to the village, but found it empty, houses abandoned, fields overgrown. The forest had claimed the land. I left that place, but the song never left me. Sometimes when the night is still, I hear it carried on the wind, reminding me that some spirits never rest, and some curses are older than time itself. Story the end.
Story number 14.
The village of Zhuravka was small, tucked away in the folds of the dense Ukrainian forest near the Carpathian foothills. It was the kind of place where every family knew the history of every other family, where the old ways and old fears still held sway over everyday life. My great-grandmother used to tell me stories from there. Stories about spirits, curses, and things that lurk just beyond the edge of human sight. At the time, I thought they were nothing but fairy tales meant to scare children and keep them from wandering into the forest at night. I never imagined those stories would come alive. After my grandfather passed away, I decided to visit Jurovka to settle his affairs and perhaps learn more about my heritage. The village had changed very little in the decades since I last saw it, and yet it felt heavier somehow, as if the air itself was thick with unease. The locals eyed me with suspicion, rarely meeting my gaze. They spoke in hushed tones, warning me not to linger after dusk, but when pressed, they offered little explanation beyond cryptic references to the old burdens. The house I inherited stood at the edge of the village, bordering the forest. It was a wooden structure, simple and weathered, with a steep roof and small windows darkened by grime. Inside, the air was cold and stale, smelling faintly of earth and smoke. I spent the first day cleaning and unpacking a few belongings, but my sleep was restless. Every night, I awoke to the sound of faint whispers, as if voices drifted through the walls, speaking in an old dialect I barely understood. One evening, as twilight settled and the village grew quiet, I noticed something strange. From my window, I could see a faint light flickering deep within the forest. Curious, I wrapped myself in a coat and ventured out, the ground damp beneath my feet and the trees towering like ancient sentinels. The light pulsed like a lantern but moved slowly, weaving between the trunks. I followed it cautiously until it stopped near a small clearing. There, I saw a woman standing by an old stone well. Her dress was white and flowing, stained with dirt and tangled in branches. Her hair was long and black, hanging over her pale face that was turned toward the moon. She sang softly, a haunting melody filled with sorrow and longing. I stepped forward and she turned to look at me. Her eyes were hollow, dark pools reflecting a centuries-old grief. She whispered my name, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "Help me," she said. "Find my child." Fear rooted me to the spot, but something compelled me to speak. "Who are you?" "My name is Anya. I was wronged. I was drowned here, and my child was taken. They buried me alive, but I cannot rest." The forest seemed to close around us, shadows deepening. I wanted to run, but I stayed, listening as she told her story. Long ago, Anya had been accused of witchcraft, a scapegoat for the village's misfortunes. Her husband, jealous and cruel, had condemned her to death, throwing her into the well. Her child was taken by others, lost to the world. When she finished, the wind picked up, carrying her voice away like a ghostly lament. I hurried back to the village, heart pounding, mind racing. The next day, I sought out the oldest resident of Jurovka, Baba Olena, a woman said to know the secrets of the forest and the spirits that dwelled there. She listened to my story and nodded gravely. "The well is cursed," she said. "Anya's spirit is bound to it, and her sorrow poisons the land. If you want peace, you must find her child. Only then will she rest." I spent days combing through village records, old letters, and faded photographs. I learned that Anya's child was taken by a family that had long since left the village, and no one knew what became of the boy. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. At night, the hauntings worsened. The house groaned and whispered. I heard footsteps on the porch, saw shadowy figures darting past the windows, and the smell of damp earth and decay filled the rooms. The cold was relentless, settling deep into my bones. One night, I awoke to find a small bundle on my doorstep, a faded, tattered doll. It was old, handmade, with button eyes and a threadbare dress. I picked it up, and suddenly the room filled with the sound of a child laughing, fragile and distant. Then silence. Driven by a mix of dread and determination, I decided to return to the well. The moon was high and full, casting silver light on the dark forest. As I approached, I saw the figure of Anya again, standing by the water's edge. "Do you have my child?" she asked, voice trembling. "I'm trying," I said, "but I don't know where to find him." She nodded sadly and stepped aside, revealing a small wooden box half buried near the stones. Inside, I found a bundle of old letters, a rusted locket, and a faded photograph of a boy with sad eyes. "I remember now," I whispered. "He was taken to the city, raised by strangers." Anya smiled faintly, the first warmth I had seen from her. "Thank you." Suddenly, the water in the well churned and a cold wind swept through the clearing. I felt a presence brush past me, gentle and sorrowful, then it was gone. From that night on, the hauntings ceased. The village felt lighter, the forest less oppressive. I buried the box near the well, planting wildflowers on the spot. I left Zurovka shortly after, but the memory of Anya and her sorrow stayed with me. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I still hear her song carried on the breeze, a reminder that some spirits linger until their stories are told and their pain is acknowledged. Story the end.
Story number 15.
The village of Malinovka had always been a place where the old ways lingered, where even the youngest children knew to respect the shadows that grew long between the ancient trees. My grandmother used to tell me stories of spirits that walked the forests at night, of restless souls trapped between worlds, and of dark bargains made under moonless skies. I never believed them. That was before the summer I spent at my grandfather's house, when the veil between the living and the dead seemed to grow thin, and the past reached out to drag me into its depths. Grandfather's house sat on the edge of the village, right where the forest began. It was a heavy, timbered building with a steep roof, green shutters, and a wooden porch worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and old wood smoke, and every corner seemed to hum with quiet secrets. The villagers told me to be careful, especially after sunset. They spoke in hushed tones about the Upir, the Slavic vampire spirits, and the Mavka, the forest's seductive dead. But I was a city girl, modern and skeptical, and I dismissed their warnings as superstition. The first strange thing happened the day I arrived. As I walked through the forest path leading to the house, I found a small, freshly dug hole near an ancient oak. There were no footprints, no signs of animals, just the earth turned and hollow. I felt a chill and covered it with leaves, but the unease lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, the house seemed to breathe around me. The wooden floorboards creaked with unseen steps. A cold draft whispered down the hallway. Then I heard it, a faint rasping close to my ear. I jolted upright, but no one was there. In the days that followed, things worsened. Objects moved on their own. A spoon sliding across the table, a chair rocking gently when no one sat in it. I heard voices murmuring in an old tongue I could not understand, and sometimes when I looked outside, I caught glimpses of pale-ale figures watching me from the trees. Determined to find answers, I sought out the village elder, Baba Yelena, a woman known for her knowledge of folk magic and the spirit world. Her tiny house was filled with dried flowers, candles, and strange symbols carved into the walls. "You have disturbed them," she said grimly when I told her what was happening. "The forest spirits, the Upir, they do not like outsiders, especially those who do not honor the old ways." She gave me a small charm made of iron and garlic, and instructed me to burn sage and leave offerings at the edge of the woods. That night I followed her advice. I set a small fire and laid out bread, salt, and vodka. As I whispered prayers, my grandmother once taught me, the air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped sharply. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with long, flowing hair, eyes like dark pools, and skin pale as moonlight. She was the Mavka. Her voice was like a song, haunting and beautiful, but there was something terrible in her gaze. She reached out a hand to me, and I felt an icy touch like death itself. I closed my eyes and whispered the prayers again. When I opened them, she was gone. The next morning, I found the small offerings untouched, but the hole near the oak was filled with fresh soil. That day, Baba Yelena told me the story of the forest, how long ago a young woman had been betrayed and murdered near the oak, her spirit cursed to wander forever as a Mavka, luring the living to share her fate. She warned me the Upir were restless too, seeking new victims to feed their eternal hunger. The nights became worse. The cold grew unbearable. I was plagued by nightmares of being dragged beneath the earth by invisible hands, of eyes watching me from every shadow. One night I heard scratching at the window, a slow, deliberate tapping like claws on glass. I dared not look. The next day, I found deep scratches on the wooden frame shaped like ancient runes. I knew then that the spirits were angry. They wanted something from me, an offering, an apology, or perhaps a sacrifice. Desperation led me back to Baba Yelena, who prepared a ritual to appease the spirits. We gathered at the clearing near the oak tree, lighting candles and chanting incantations in the old language. As the night deepened, a wind rose. swirling leaves and whispers. The Mavka appeared again, joined by shadowy figures with glowing eyes, the Upir. They circled us, silent but threatening. Baba Yelena stood firm, invoking protective words and casting sacred salt. The spirits hissed and recoiled, then vanished into the night. Exhausted but relieved, I returned to the house. In the following days, the haunting ceased. The air warmed, and the house felt alive again. I left Malinovka soon after, but the memory of those nights never faded. Sometimes, when the wind rustles through the trees just right, I still hear the faint echo of the Mavka's song, and I wonder if the forest ever truly lets go of its dead. Story the end.
Story number 16.
The village of Starozhinka lay deep in the Carpathian Mountains, where the dense forest seemed to swallow sunlight whole, and the fog clung to the ground like a living thing. It was a place that time forgot, where the old Slavic traditions lived on in whispered prayers and cautions passed from one generation to the next. My family came from there, or so I was told, an origin I had always brushed off as a quaint story, until I found myself standing in that very village on a cold autumn afternoon under a sky heavy with gray clouds. I had inherited my grandmother's house, a crumbling wooden cottage on the edge of the forest. When I arrived, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the villagers regarded me with a wary mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They spoke little, but when I asked about the house's history, their eyes darkened, and they said only, "You must be careful. The forest does not forget." The house itself was small and ancient, its walls warped and creaking. Inside, the smell of old wood and smoke clung to everything. As I unpacked, a chill settled over me that had nothing to do with the autumn cold. It was as if the house was watching, waiting. The first night, I slept poorly. Strange noises came from the walls, low groans like distant voices whispering in a language I barely recognized. I told myself it was the wind, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The second night was worse. Around midnight, I woke to a faint tapping on the window. When I looked, I saw nothing but the dense blackness of the forest. But the tapping persisted, slow and steady, like fingernails tracing the glass. I pulled the curtain shut, but the tapping followed, now at the door. On the third day, I ventured into the village to seek out an elder, someone who might explain what was happening. I found Baba Yelena sitting outside her hut, knitting under a gnarled apple tree. Her eyes were sharp and penetrating. "You've come to the house," she said before I could speak. "The one by the forest. You don't belong there." "I inherited it from my grandmother," I replied cautiously. I didn't know anything was wrong. Baba Yelena sighed deeply. "Your family carries an old curse. The forest spirit Leshy watches that place. Long ago, your ancestors broke a sacred oath. The Leshy does not forgive easily. I had heard stories of Leshy, protector of the forest, trickster, punisher, but I thought they were myths, folklore to keep children from wandering in the woods." "What kind of oath?" I asked. "Your great-grandfather cut down a sacred tree, one that was the home of the spirit. He took its wood to build the house. Since then, the Leshy has haunted the family, demanding restitution." That night, as I sat by the fireplace, the temperature in the room plummeted. Shadows seemed to twist and lengthen, and a low growl echoed from the forest's edge. The tapping at the door returned, louder now, more urgent. I opened the door and stepped outside into the cold night. The moon was hidden by clouds, but a pale light glowed from deep within the trees. I heard a voice, a deep guttural whisper speaking in Old Slavic, warning me to leave. Suddenly, a figure appeared between the trees. It was tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes and limbs like gnarled branches. The Leshy. My heart pounded, but I stood my ground. "You have taken what was not yours," it growled. "The debt must be paid." I remembered Baba Yelena's words. The only way to appease the spirit was to offer a sacrifice, not of life, but of something precious, a token of respect for the forest. The next day I gathered herbs, bread, and salt, traditional offerings to spirits. As dusk fell, I walked into the forest, carrying the gifts to the base of a massive, ancient oak. The tree's bark was scarred and blackened, a clear sign of the desecration. I laid the offerings carefully, murmuring the prayers Baba Yelena had taught me, asking for forgiveness and peace. As the last words left my lips, the forest fell silent. The oppressive feeling lifted, replaced by a fragile calm. A wind rustled the leaves, and I thought I heard a faint whisper of thanks. I returned to the village, where the people greeted me with quiet nods. Baba Yelena smiled softly. You have done what few dared. The curse is eased, but remember, the forest's memory is long. Respect it, and it may yet spare you. I stayed in the house for a few more days, the whispers and tapping ceasing. Yet, on clear nights when the moon casts silver light through the trees, I still feel eyes watching from the shadows, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. Story the end.
Story number 17.
In 2013, I lived in Poland for a year, in a little town called Nowe Miasto nad Pilicą. I had taken a job teaching English at a local high school through a cultural exchange program, and they put me up in a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. It was quiet, rural, and colder than I was used to. My place was next to an overgrown stretch of forest that the locals seemed to avoid. The house itself wasn't much. One bedroom, a kitchen with old appliances, a bathroom with a weak water heater, and a creaky living room with warped floorboards. The walls were yellowed with age, and the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic never left the air. But the rent was cheap, and I didn't expect luxury. My neighbor, Mrs. Kowalska, was a hunched old woman who often brought me soup or smoked meats. She had lived in the area her whole life. One evening, when she came over to bring me stew, she asked where I was staying. I pointed at my house, and she frowned. That place is not good, she said, adjusting the scarf around her head. Not since the war. I thought she was referring to the general devastation from World War II, but she leaned closer, eyes watery and sharp. People died there, not just from bombs. There was a man, a bad man. He lived there during the occupation. I asked what she meant, and she waved her hand like brushing away flies. You should ask the priest, or better, find another place. I didn't push her. I didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. I was a foreigner in a town full of old legends and wartime scars. But I never forgot the way she looked at me when she said, "He doesn't rest." Strange things started happening about a month later. It started subtly. The hallway light would flicker no matter how many times I changed the bulb. At night, the floor creaked like someone was walking across it, though I was alone. I chalked it up to the house settling, or the cold causing wood to expand and contract. One night around 2 a.m., I woke up to what sounded like whispering. I sat up in bed and strained to listen. The sound was faint, like someone speaking in another room. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. I got out of bed and walked quietly into the hallway. The whispering stopped. I stood in the middle of the hallway, listening. Nothing. I even turned off the heater by thinking maybe it was the fan making noise. As I turned to go back to bed, I caught something from the corner of my eye. The front door was open. I know I had locked it. I always did. That door stuck in the frame and made a loud click when it latched. But now it hung open, just slightly, enough to let in the biting cold. I walked over and shut it, twisting the lock and checking it twice. My skin crawled. Still, I tried to sleep. The dreams started soon after. At first, they were just unsettling. I would see a man standing at the edge of the forest, face obscured by shadow, dressed in black. He never moved, never spoke. He just stared. Over time, the dreams changed. In one, I was lying in bed, paralyzed, while someone dragged something heavy through the hallway. I woke up sweating and found faint drag marks across the floor, like something had been pulled from the front door toward my room. I began recording myself at night using an old phone with a sound recorder app. The first few nights captured only silence. But then, on the fifth night, I heard it, soft, labored breathing around 3:12 a.m., and a low voice muttering in Polish. I played it for one of the teachers at school, and her face went pale. He's saying, "Where is she? She was here. I saw her go in." I didn't know what to think. The staff grew colder toward me after that. Some refused to speak to me at all. I think they were afraid I had brought something back. Out of desperation, I went to see the local priest, Father Marek. He was in his 60s, kind but formal. When I told him where I lived, he sighed deeply. "You should have come to me sooner," he said. I asked him what was wrong with the house, and he told me a story. In 1943, during the Nazi occupation, a local man named Kazimierz Goral lived in that house. He worked with the Germans, informing on his neighbors, especially Jews and resistance fighters. He was feared and hated. But that wasn't the worst of it. When his wife discovered what he was doing, she tried to flee. He killed her in the house. Some said he buried her body beneath the floorboards. After the war, he disappeared. Some claimed he was killed by the resistance. Others believed he escaped. The house remained empty for years. People who tried to live there didn't stay long. I asked if he could bless the house. He agreed, reluctantly. The next afternoon, he arrived with holy water and a heavy expression. As he walked through the rooms, he chanted prayers in Latin, flicking water across the walls and doors. When he reached the hallway, his hand froze. I followed his gaze. There was a smear of dark brown on the wall near the floor, like something had leaked from inside the plaster. He touched it with his fingers, sniffed it, and frowned. "Blood turns brown with time," he said quietly. I watched him kneel and press his palm against the floorboards. Something was buried here. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., the air grew ice cold. I lay under my blankets, eyes wide, as the familiar creak of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Then the whispering began again. Only this time it was closer. Right outside my door, I held my breath. The door handle began to turn slowly, inch by inch. I had locked it, but it rattled like someone was trying to break in. I jumped out of bed and pressed my back against it. The pressure stopped. Then I heard breathing. On the other side, deep, ragged, angry. I stayed like that until morning. I moved out the next day. I stayed with one of the other teachers in town for a few weeks. I told the program coordinator I couldn't live there anymore. When I went back to get the rest of my things, I brought 2 people with me. The house was quiet, but we all felt it. A weight in the air, an unnatural cold. As we packed up, one of them, a local man named Tomek, asked, "Did you see the basement?" I told him the house didn't have one. He frowned. "Are you sure?" He tapped his foot on the floor near the back wall of the kitchen, a hollow sound. I'd never noticed. He and the other guys started moving the old fridge. Behind it, concealed by a wooden panel, was a small trapdoor. I didn't want to open it, but Tomek insisted. He pulled it up, revealing a narrow staircase, barely wide enough for one person. The air that rushed out smelled like rot. Tomek shone his flashlight down the stairs, and I saw them. Wooden steps, soaked dark, leading to a dirt floor below. We didn't go down. None of us wanted to. We closed the trapdoor and left. I later found out from the town archives that Kazimierz Goral's wife was never found, and that 2 sets of human remains had been discovered in the forest nearby in the 1950s. One male, one female, but neither could be identified. Sometimes I still dream about that house. I see the hallway, the flickering light, the open front door, and always, standing just outside, is the man in black. He doesn't move. He just watches. Story the end.
Story number 18.
In 2008, my cousin Marco and I traveled from Zagreb to a small village called Gora, located near the Bosnian border. Marco had inherited an old house from his great-uncle, a man none of us had ever met. The inheritance came unexpectedly, through a lawyer's letter in the mail, with only a property deed and a key inside. There was no ceremony, no family connection. Marco was curious, and I was free for the summer. We decided to go and check it out. The village itself was barely on the map. About 30 houses scattered along one cracked road, with hills and thick forest hemming it in on all sides. We arrived in the late afternoon, taking a battered road that curved through woodland for miles until the trees suddenly opened up, revealing the village like something forgotten. The sun was low, and the whole place had that stillness only remote places possess. No children, no animals, just quiet. The house sat near the edge of the village, where the woods began again. It was a 2-story stone building with a sagging wooden porch and shuttered windows. We stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under our shoes. Marco tried the key, and it turned easily in the rusted lock. The door swung open with a long, tired groan. The inside smelled of old wood, dried herbs, and something else I couldn't place, something sour and damp. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs clung to the corners like the house was growing its own skin. There were faded photos on the walls, black and white portraits of grim-looking people with sunken eyes and stiff poses. We set our bags in the main room downstairs and spent the next hour cleaning enough space to sleep. There was no electricity, only oil lamps, and no running water, just an old well in the backyard. We made a fire in the hearth, opened 2 cans of beans, and sat in the dim light, already regretting the decision to stay overnight. That night, sleep did not come easily. The air was heavy, and the silence pressed against my ears. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint sound, scraping like nails on wood. At first, I thought it was Marco, but he was snoring softly on the other side of the room. I lay still, staring at the ceiling beams. The scraping continued for a few minutes, stopped, and then something else. A soft shuffle, like bare feet across the wooden floor above us. My body tensed, my breath shallow. I didn't move. The footsteps paused, then resumed, slower this time, circling above us. I waited for them to stop, to fade. They didn't. They continued until dawn, only stopping when the first light broke through the shutters. In the morning, I told Marco. He laughed it off, saying it was probably mice or maybe a raccoon trapped in the attic. But I saw the uncertainty in his eyes. We went up to check. Just a bare attic space, dust-covered and empty. No signs of animals, no droppings, no nests. Just a small, square trapdoor in the floor leading to the crawlspace below the house. We didn't open it. The next few days brought more of the same. Every night, the footsteps returned, always above us, sometimes directly over where we slept. During the day, we walked around the village, hoping to find someone who could tell us about the house or Marco's great-uncle. But the villagers were distant. Old women closed their shutters when we walked by. One man, the owner of a tiny market, told us in hushed tones to leave before the dead woke up. When we pressed him, he shook his head and said, "You don't belong to that house. It won't forget your strangers." That night, Marco bolted upright in bed, gasping. I turned the lamp on and saw sweat dripping down his face. He said he dreamed of a woman with no eyes, her mouth sewn shut with black thread, crouched at the foot of his bed. When he tried to move, she crawled toward him, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. I didn't sleep at all after that. We sat by the fire, the oil lamp casting flickering shadows across the walls. Around 2 a.m., we heard the footsteps again, but this time they came down the stairs. We froze. No words, just listening. The steps were deliberate, slow, one after another, creaking the old wood beneath. They reached the bottom and stopped just outside the room. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood up, heart racing. The door was open. Nothing moved. I took a step forward, weapon raised, and a gust of wind blew through the room, snuffing out the lamp. The fire went black, total darkness. Marco screamed. I lunged toward him, groping blindly. My hand found his arm, trembling like mine, and then we heard it. Whispering, not from outside the room, but inside, all around us, hissing, guttural whispers in a language I didn't know. The same language Marco heard in his dream, and then the door slammed shut. We didn't sleep that night. When daylight returned, we packed our bags and left the house. We drove to the next town, got a room in a modern hotel, and didn't speak much for the rest of the day. That night, we decided to go back and retrieve the deed. Marco didn't want the house anymore, but he needed the paperwork to legally renounce the inheritance. We returned the next afternoon, and the house looked worse than before, like it had aged another decade in just 2 days. The air smelled worse too, sour and metallic. Inside, the photos on the wall had all fallen to the floor. Every single one. Some had shattered. Their faces were scratched out. Not by glass, scratched from within the photo itself, like someone had clawed at the image with rage. Marco found the deed in a drawer by the fireplace. As we turned to leave, a loud thump echoed from the attic. This time I wasn't curious. We were halfway out the door when we heard a voice. A woman's voice, low and dragging, like her throat was full of ash. It said Marco's name, once. Then silence. We ran. Back at the hotel, Marco tried to burn the deed, but it wouldn't catch. The paper darkened but didn't curl. It didn't blacken. It just stayed intact. We threw it in the hotel trash and left early the next morning, headed back to Zagreb. Things didn't go back to normal. 2 weeks later, Marco stopped answering calls. I went to his apartment and found the door unlocked. Inside, every mirror had been covered with cloth or turned to face the wall. There were markings on his bedroom floor, chalk symbols in circles, some in what looked like blood. His laptop was open, showing a single web page in Cyrillic. I translated what I could. They dwell in the forgotten earth. The house is not a house, it is a gate. Marco came back 3 days later, but he wasn't the same. He didn't speak much, and when he did, it was nonsense. Sometimes he'd wake up screaming, talking about the woman with no eyes. He said she was trying to climb out, that the trapdoor was open, that she had remembered his name. He disappeared 1 month after that. No note, no signs of struggle, just gone. The police found nothing. I moved cities. I burned all the photos from the trip, deleted everything on my phone. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear footsteps above me. And sometimes they come down the stairs. Story the end.
Story number 19.
The first time I heard about the house, I was 10. My grandmother told me stories in hushed tones, whispering between spoonfuls of soup during cold Ukrainian winters, always when the wind howled through the cracks in the kitchen window. She spoke of a lonely house nestled deep in the woods beyond our village, past the dried creek bed and the rows of fir trees that blotted out the sky. "Don't go there," she said one night, her knotted hand tightening around mine. No one comes back the same, if they come back at all. As a child, I believed her, because in villages like ours, belief is part of survival. But as I grew, the stories turned into memories, and the memories dulled. I moved to Kiev, studied engineering, and returned only occasionally for funerals and holidays. By the time I was 34, I thought ghosts were for old women and fairy tales. Until my uncle died. He had lived alone in that same village all his life, never marrying, never leaving. A quiet man, he didn't talk much but was dependable and steady, always working in his small workshop by the barn. When the news of his sudden death reached me, just dropped dead in the yard, I felt a pang of guilt. I hadn't seen him in years. So I returned, not for belief, but obligation. The funeral was simple, just a priest, a few neighbors, and a pine coffin that smelled like resin. Afterward, I stayed in his house to sort through what he left behind. He had no children, no one else to claim his things. The house was small and old, filled with the scent of tobacco and damp wood. His tools were lined up on the workbench with meticulous care. Photographs hung on the walls, some of me as a child, some of people I didn't recognize. But what caught my attention was an envelope nailed to the inside of his workshop door. My name was scrawled on the front in his unmistakable handwriting. Inside was a single page. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't go to the Red House. Don't follow the voices. They don't forget. They don't forgive." I read it 3 times. I remembered the stories my grandmother told. I hadn't thought of them in years, but they surfaced now like an old wound under fresh skin. I could have left it alone. I should have. But it stayed with me, those words. That warning. I asked around the village. Some laughed, others changed the subject. But one old man, Ivan, who used to drink with my uncle, pulled me aside. "He went there, you know," Ivan whispered, looking over his shoulder as if afraid someone might hear. "Your uncle, a few years back. Went in the fall and came back with snow in his eyes. Wouldn't speak for a week. I asked him what he saw. He just said, 'She's still in there.'" "Who?" Ivan just spat on the ground and walked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, low creaks, the wind tapping the window, maybe rats in the walls. I tried to ignore it, but around 2 a.m., I heard something different. A voice. Faint. Delicate. It was saying my name. I froze. It wasn't outside. It was inside the room, barely above a whisper, as if someone were kneeling beside my bed. But when I turned on the lamp, nothing was there. No one. I didn't sleep at all after that. By morning, I had made my decision. I had to see the house. It took me an hour to find it. I followed the overgrown trail behind the barn, then through a pine thicket that darkened with every step. Eventually, I reached the creek bed, dry and cracked like I remembered, and climbed the rise on the other side. And there it was. Half hidden by skeletal trees and cloaked in red paint flaking off in curling strips, the house stood like a wound in the forest. The windows were black. The roof sagged. The door hung open slightly, inviting in a way that felt predatory. The air was heavy, like just before a storm. I don't know what pushed me forward. I should have turned back. Every step toward the porch felt like moving through syrup. I called out, half expecting someone to answer. No response. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Mold, decay, and something else. Something sweet and rancid. The interior was choked with dust. Furniture sat where it had probably stood for decades. A broken rocking chair, a table with one leg chewed down to splinters, and a mirror on the far wall. But it wasn't reflecting me. I stared at it, blinking. I was standing directly in front of it, but the mirror showed only the room. Not me. Not anything living. My mouth went dry. I backed away, knocking over a chair. It crashed to the floor, stirring up a choking cloud of dust. That's when I heard it again, the voice. It came from upstairs. I shouldn't have gone up. I know that now. But I did. The stairs groaned under my weight. At the top was a hallway, peeling wallpaper, revealing strange marks scratched into the wood beneath. Slashes, symbols, some of them looking almost like Cyrillic letters twisted into unnatural forms. At the end of the hall was a door. It was closed, but something was behind it. I could feel it, the way you feel someone watching you in the dark. My hand reached out, trembling, cold. I pushed it open. The room was empty, except for a small wooden crib in the center. It was old, too old, the kind with high bars and rusted hinges. Inside was a bundle of blankets. I stepped closer. The blanket moved. I froze. Slowly, carefully, I pulled it back. There was no baby. Only a doll, porcelain, cracked, with painted blue eyes and matted hair. But the thing that made my stomach lurch was the fact that it was warm, like a living thing, and its eyes blinked. I stumbled backward, knocking into the wall. That's when the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to run, but the room was no longer empty. Standing beside the crib was a woman, pale, thin. Her eyes were black, hollow pits, and her mouth hung open in an endless scream without sound. Her hair flowed upward like it was underwater. She raised one hand and pointed at me. The walls began to bleed. Not metaphorically, real, dark, oozing blood seeped from the cracks in the walls, thick and slow. The room grew colder. My breath steamed in the air. The woman opened her mouth wider, impossibly wide, until her jaw cracked. Then she screamed. It wasn't a noise meant for human ears. It was metal tearing, bones breaking, a child's cry buried under centuries of pain. I dropped to my knees, covering my ears, but the sound was inside me, in my skull, my blood. I could feel her in my thoughts, pushing memories out, replacing them with hers. I saw fire, screams, children locked in the house, her children, burned alive while villagers watched and did nothing. I saw her clawing at the door while they held her back. Then the noose, then the silence. She never left. I don't remember escaping. One moment I was in that room, the next I was stumbling through the trees, my ears ringing, shirt torn, feet bleeding. I reached my uncle's house by dusk and locked every door. I stayed up all night, shaking. The next day I packed everything. I left. I never came back. But the dreams did. They started a week later, always the same. I'm in the red house. The woman is watching. The crib rocks gently. The doll whispers my name. Sometimes I wake up with scratches on my arms. Once I woke up with ash on my pillow. I saw a priest. He blessed my apartment, said prayers, lit incense. It didn't help. I've tried therapy, sleep aids. Nothing works. I can feel her, even now as I write this. She's waiting. Last week, I heard my uncle's voice on my answering machine. He's been dead for months. Don't go to the red house, he said. Don't follow the voices. But I already did. And now she knows me. Story the end.